Good afternoon. I'm Gavin Cleesby, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I'm happy to welcome the people who are joining us in person, as well as the people who are joining us online. For anyone who might be visiting MHS for the first time, the Massachusetts Historical Society is the first historical society in America. We date back all the way to 1791. As I like to say, when we were founded, our founder, Jeremy Belknap, wrote to Paul Revere, and Paul Revere wrote back. So for the past 232 years, we have been collecting manuscripts, diaries, documents, all sorts of material that makes up American history, and making that available to researchers for free throughout the country. We also host a wide variety of programs. We're only able to host programs like this thanks to the support of our members and donors. So if you enjoyed the program this afternoon, I hope you'll come back for future programs, and I hope you'll consider becoming a member or supporting MHS. This afternoon, we're happy to welcome Dr. Jenny Rose. She is a research fellow and historian of religions in the Zoroastrian Studies program at Claremont Graduate University's Religion Department. She holds a doctorate in ancient Iranian studies from Columbia University. She was also a fellow, short-term fellow at MHS in 2018. And her book came out shortly thereafter in 2019, and we were planning to host her in 2020, and then things went slightly awry. But she did use quite a bit of material from our collection, and for the people who are joining us in person, immediately outside this room, there's a display case with some items that were used in the book that you can see the originals of. So this afternoon, she'll be discussing her book, Between Boston and Bombay, Cultural and Commercial Encounters, which maps the circulation of goods, capital, and ideas between Bombay and New England, beginning just a few years after the Declaration of Independence. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jenny Rose.
Thank you, Gavin. I would also like to thank Gavin for organizing the event today, and for Olivia and George for their support, and Peter for putting on the little display outside. As he said, there is a particular archive collection of letters that's really quite interesting. So the topic of my, can you hear me? The topic of my talk today, oh, and I'd also like to welcome anybody who's online who might or might not be able to see me, but I know I have some friends out there as well. The topic of my talk today is based on research, as Gavin indicated, that was undertaken a few years ago at the MHS through a Conrad and Elizabeth Wright short-term fellowship. And I'd previously, about 4 years before then, had a very short-term fellowship also at the Phillips Library of the Peabody Essex Museum. The subject of my talk today had been noodling around my brain for several years before I began to shape the narrative that became in its current form as this book. The idea for the research germinated when I visited the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem about a decade ago and came across this small oil portrait that was hanging in the East India Marine Hall. I knew of the portrait's existence, but I was intrigued to see it in person. The portraits of a Parsi Zoroastrian broker who lived and worked in Bombay, modern Mumbai, in the late 18th, early 19th century. It dates to about 1802, and it was donated a couple of years after its completion to the collection of Salem's recently founded East India Marine Society. So it was one of the earliest donations from India to that society's collection. Of course, the portrait raised all kinds of questions in my mind. What connection did its subject matter have with the people of Salem, specifically the members of its East India Marine Society? What did the Parsi in the portrait know of Americans and America, and vice versa? Did the Yankee sailors, who by the early 19th century were regular visitors to Bombay, associate this figure with the ancient Iranian religion that was attributed to Zoroaster? The same Zoroaster who had been reimagined so many times by European philosophers and literati, and who had featured most recently as the high priest of a temple of wisdom in Mozart's Magic Flute. Of course, the protagonist, Zarathustra, is based on, well, the name is taken from the Europeanized version of the founder of the religion, the founder of the religion of Zoroastrianism. So this research into how newly independent Americans perceived both Zoroaster and the latter-day practitioners of the religion that was associated with him followed quite neatly on from a previous inquiry that I'd done into the European appropriation of Zoroaster, whose ancient Iranian name is Zarathustra. Before I arrived in Bombay, in Boston, I had determined that the time frame of my book would be 1771 to 1865. And my time at the MHS filled in many of the gaps in the narrative, while also uncovering lots of new sources and new characters to explore. So this afternoon, as Gavin indicated, I'm going to present some of my findings from this collection here, but also some from the Phillips Library of the Peabody Essex Museum and the G.W. Blunt White Library in Mystic, Connecticut. So I began my time at the MHS searching for examples of American travel to and trade with India in the period following the Treaty of Paris. And the Treaty of Paris was ratified by the Continental Congress in early 1784. It delineated the boundaries of the United States as an independent nation, and it allowed Americans to trade directly with India. Immediately, the merchant mariners of New England and further down the coast, New York and Philadelphia, but particularly New England, Salem and Boston, began to move goods between ports in the US, India and Britain, as well as other regions that were collectively referred to as the East Indies. At the Phillips Library, I came across what appears to be the earliest document recording direct interaction between one such mariner and a local broker in Bombay. I'm using the term Bombay because that's the term that's used in the period. So this evidence was a letter from a young man, Elias Haskett Darby Jr., known as Haskett. He was the son of a Salem-based sea captain, Elias Haskett Darby Sr., whose fleet of ships began rounding the Cape of Good Hope, bound for the East Indies in late 1784. In September of 1788, the son Haskett wrote from Bombay to his father in Salem. I don't know whether you can see here. This is this bit here. I arrived here on the 8th of this month. My passage from the Isle of France, that's Mauritius, modern Mauritius, being only 24 days. I find that we are here on the same footing with all other strangers, being subject to a duty on most goods. The cotton is better than what I supposed. A few pages into this letter, Haskett writes, my broker's name is Nasavanji Monakji. He is said to be worth £200,000 sterling. And this is, of course, the very broker whose portrait hangs in the Peabody Essex Museum. And that is a vast amount for 1788. Nasavanji Monakji was already an established broker for the East India Company. His older brother, Framji, was the master shipbuilder for the company at the dockyard in Bombay. And the dockyard, the dry dockyard, had been built by their grandfather, Lauji Nasavanji. Lauji had been bought from Gujarat on commission by the East India Company with a whole team of Parsi shipwrights. And the Gujarati term Vadia or Wadia, which means shipbuilder or shipwright, became the surname of the family not long after Nasavanji Monakji's time. Of course, American seafarers and merchants were keen to acquire some of this fabulous wealth of the East Indies for themselves. Haskett's father trained several sea captains on vessels that were engaged in the trade. Several became merchants in their own right, with their own ships and crews. Another early local East India merchant, Benjamin Joy, was the first American to have a consular role in India. He was appointed by George Washington and based in Calcutta, although of course the British did not recognize his right to hold office. This sea chest on the right is part of the MHS collection and is thought to have been made in India. The letter on the left is from a sea captain from Massachusetts named Amasa Delano, who was in, it's to this sea captain, and Amasa Delano was in Bombay in 1794. He'd asked for advice from Joy about obtaining freight in Calcutta. While in Bombay, Delano was apparently intrigued by the Parsi Zoroastrian custom of exposure of the dead in their so-called towers of silence, or dakhma. The first of these towers had been constructed by the Parsis in Bombay in the 1670s, and they were still standing when Delano visited. Although he was not allowed to see inside the towers, only Parsi Zoroastrians were allowed into the area around the towers, Delano nonetheless offered a brief description in the widely read travel narrative of his Voyages. And Delano becomes the model for one of the characters in the Herman Melville novel, Benita Serena. A much younger Yankee visitor to India a few years after Delano was Thomas Wren Ward. His correspondence is held in the MHS, and we have some of the letters, the earliest letters that he wrote. Thomas's father, William Ward, was a captain who sent his son to sea at the age of 10. He actually accompanied him, so there was some fatherly protection going on. This letter that you can see here was written in May 1797 by Thomas from the Cape Verde Islands to his mother on his first voyage. The young lad writes here, "I was only seasick 2 days and since have been very well. On our passage here, Papa has kept me regular to my studies from 8 to 12 in the forenoon and from 1 to 4 in the afternoon. I hope I have made some improvements already, and by the end of this voyage, I hope I shall be a tolerable scholar." What an experience for a 10-year-old. In a second letter to his mother in July of the same year, Thomas noted, "We are now arrived in Calcutta after a passage of 5 months and 20 days. Calcutta is a beautiful city, but rather too warm for me." By October of 1802, Thomas Wren Ward, now aged 16, had risen to the ranks of second mate on the ship Pallas. It was captained by John Dalling. John Dalling was from Salem, and he had become a member of its East India Marine Society just prior to setting out for India in late September 1804. He was on a new command. That command was the Ulysses. On this voyage that took place between September 1804 and September 1805, Thomas was the first mate. John Dalling was under instruction from the ship's owner, William Gray, to sail first to Bombay and then to Kolkata, before returning home. The day after the Ulysses returned to Boston from that round India voyage, another merchant mariner from Salem, named Ichabod Nichols, wrote to John Dalling with reference to a letter that Thomas Ward's father had delivered to him. This is the letter from Nichols. Nichols relates that this letter, delivered by Captain Ward this morning, was from our good friend Nasavanji Monakji of Bombay, by which it appears that he has sent by you to my care a Persian dress for the East India Marine Society and a pair of shawls for myself and my son. This Persian dress, apparently a complete set of clothing formerly worn by Nasavanji, must have been picked up by Dalling from the broker himself in Bombay, along with the portrait of Nasavanji, which Dalling then donated to Salem's East India Marine Society collection as part of his obligation to contribute to its cabinet of curiosities. Salem's Marine Society board employed a local woodcarver to make a life-size figure in Nusawanji's likeness, which was later exhibited alongside those of other Indian merchants in the main hall of the museum. The outfit is a formal one, such as would have then been worn by Parsi men of high standing on important or ceremonial occasions. It consists of a jama, a long-sleeved white cotton robe that reaches to the floor, and a long, wide belt known as a pichori, over which would have been a cashmere shawl. And in his portrait, Nusawanji also wears a stiff, dark blue turban, and he's got wonderful traditional curl-toed shoes known as modris. Such items of clothing would have been on display not only in the museum, but before then in the annual street parade in Salem. This was organized by the Marine Society just before its annual general meeting each year, and it was to show the townsfolk all the artifacts that the mariners had brought from far away. The clothing was often modeled by the mariners themselves. On Friday, November the 6th, 1807, the Salem Gazette reported that the procession's exhibition of dresses and instruments which had been brought from the distant regions visited by the mariners, in some measure inform us of the customs, manners, and arts of their inhabitants. The sailors' stories of the people and the practices that they encountered on their journeys would have captivated local citizens, I feel. Such accounts also drew attention to the many heathen souls beyond the shores of America and Europe. In May of 1812, Henry Lee, who was the supercargo, that is the person in charge of the cargo and its sale for Andrew Cabot Jr., arrived in Calcutta. He was eager to profit from the uptick in trade following the lifting of the 1807 to 1809 trade embargo. 2 months later, Lee noted the arrival in port of several ships from Massachusetts, including the Tartar and the Caravan. The brig Caravan, which was captained by Augustine Hurd on his first captaincy, carried the first 2 missionaries from the United States to India. The British immediately expelled them from Calcutta because it was not in the East India Charter that missionaries should be allowed in areas of India that were controlled by the British. A second ship out of Philadelphia, the Harmony, brought 3 more missionaries. They'd all been ordained at the same time and the week before they left and just kind of raced out. And those 3 missionaries were also told to return home on the next ship. But 2 of them managed to make their way to Bombay, where they were received by the British governor and allowed to remain, although not allowed to missionize, until the charter was changed. And these 2 Americans established the first Protestant mission in Bombay in December of 1813. One of these missionaries was the Reverend Gordon Hall, and his report of the native free schools in Bombay tells us that within 11 years, there were 26 schools under the direction of the American missionaries there, with nearly 1,500 pupils who were all taught in the local language of Marathi. Horace Bardwell's memoir of Gordon Hall was one of several missionary accounts that helped to broaden American awareness of the religions and cultures of India. But not everyone back in Massachusetts was supportive of these missionary endeavors. Many of you will know or have heard of the Reverend William Bentley, a Congregationalist minister in Salem. His diaries are wonderful accounts of not just what was happening in Salem, but of global events. He was friends with a lot of the sea captains. So Bentley disparaged these hastily ordained American missionaries as fanatics without common talents, who had embarked for India being mostly ignorant of the language and the culture of the people that they sought to convert. The Tartar, one of the other ships that was in Calcutta when the Caravan and the Harmony arrived in 1812, carried letters from the missionaries back to America. And this was the only way, of course, that communications could happen, sending your letters out with each incoming ship. And they would bring, of course, letters in return. So it was months, 4 or 5 months before people could communicate with each other. The Tartar's captain was Isaac Hinckley, whose log contains his drawing of the ship. Hinckley set sail for home in late 1812, and he comments in his log that is part of this narrative here, how odd it was not to come across any other American ship en route. So it's not until December the 30th of 1812, when the Tartar comes across a vessel from Philadelphia that's in dock at St. Bart's, that Hinckley is informed of the war with Britain that had broken out earlier in the year. So his entry for that Wednesday is, "This is the first news that I have had from America since I left. It is the worst for me that I ever heard. Oh, may God protect my wife and children and return me safe to them once more." And the log from then on is, it starts, morning starts, light squalls, wind from the wherever, and we are counting our muskets. How much do we have to defend ourselves? And eventually he comes into sight of Boston, and, home at last, we are safe. So it's a very interesting few days of entries in the log. 5 years later, we found another record of a voyage of the Tartar to and from India. And this was a more detailed and far less fraught account. Its author was William Augustus Rogers, whose brother, Richard Saltonstall Rogers, was the captain. Both were 8th generation descendants of this man, whose portrait the MHS holds. He was known as Roaring John. Roaring John's combination of Tyndale's New Testament with his own partial English translation of the Old Testament led to his martyrdom under Queen Mary in 1555. Although there were generations of Christian ministers in the Rogers family after Roaring John, the particular branch that's of interest here consisted mostly of seafarers. The older Rogers brothers, Richard and John, were both members of Salem's East India Marine Society. William, having trained as a lawyer under John Pickering, undertook this first voyage to India to prepare himself for mercantile employment and also to achieve financial independence. Perhaps he wanted to set himself up as a lawyer or a politician like his mentor, John Pickering. William was the supercargo on the Tartar, and he took the obligation to keep a log of the journey very seriously. He provided detailed descriptions of the various religions and their practitioners that he came across in Bombay. And of course, there were many: Jews, Christians, Armenians, Muslims, Hindus, and Parsis. His journal was probably written on behalf of his older brother, Richard, to fulfill Salem's Marine Society's requirement to provide an account of the people and places encountered on a voyage. William paid particular attention to the Parsi Zoroastrians, probably because he was meeting them on a fairly regular basis. As soon as the Tartar had docked at the Custom House Pier in Bombay, William went straight to his brokers, who were Nusawanji Manekji's sons, who'd retained their father's monopoly on American business in the city. And this is what he writes in his journal about the family. He says, the sons of Nusawanji Manekji, a man who sustained a most estimable character, and of his sons Nauroji and Jahangirji, Their successors in the establishment and bid fair to get all the American business. They are clever and honest. So we know that William's subsequent account of Parsi Zoroastrian religion was probably based on his discussions with the brokers, but we also know that he had a supplier who was also a guide around the city named Shapurji Sorabji. There's a whole section of the log that records what Parsi Zoroastrians of the time considered to be the most salient aspects of their religion to share with non-Parsi visitors. It's a translation of 16 Sanskrit passages which describe Parsi hospitality and civic philanthropy. The passages also define areas of Parsi Zoroastrian separateness in matters of religious practice and domestic ritual, particularly in relation to women. The last section, which I haven't included here, it describes the local Hindu rulers' positive reception of the Parsis when they'd arrived in Gujarat from Iran several hundred years earlier. But I think that the description, this positive welcome that the Hindu Raja gives to the Parsis, must also somehow reflect the prominent position of Parsis in the Bombay hierarchy of the early 19th century. And that position was partly due to Parsi activity in generating some of the civic buildings and operations and structure in the city. And by the time that William Rogers is visiting, much of their wealth is beginning to derive from the opium trade with China. So initially working with British traders, but by the 1820s with American companies, Parsi wealth grew exponentially. After the end of the Anglo-American Wars in 1815, American markets wanted more tea, more porcelain, more silk from China than they had ready money to pay for. They were using silver dollars, Spanish silver dollars, and that was becoming harder to access. And so the drug from India became a significant and practical element of the goods exchange. So we have New England merchants, Augustine Hurd, Samuel Russell, Warren Delano, Thomas and James Perkins, and later Robert Bennett Forbes, who began buying Indian opium from Bombay and Calcutta, often using Parsi brokerage and trading houses, which had their own Parsi opium examiners. Of course, American sentiment that was led by Protestant missionaries was strongly opposed to the opium trade, but account books in the MHS Hooper Sturgis collection show the activity of East Coast American firms such as Bryant and Sturgis, Perkins and Company, Russell and Company, in the business of smuggling legally purchased opium onto the Chinese market where its import was banned. A later agent for Russell's company, Robert Bennett Forbes, describes being in China at the time of the opium seizure in 1839, which began the so-called Opium Wars with Britain. Access to Chinese luxuries, along with the revenues from opium sales, brought fortunes to both Boston and Bombay before, during, and after the Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842. The wealth that was accumulated in both cities during this period enabled the construction of roads, schools, and other civic buildings. The Bank of Bombay, that was founded in 1840, had several Parsi shareholders, including relatives of Nusawanji Manekji Wadia. One of the most successful Parsi entrepreneurs in Bombay, who was knighted in 1842, was Sir Jamsetji Jijiboy, and he donated funds to build a general hospital, a causeway, and a high school, among many other edifices in Bombay. In Boston, the merchant Thomas Perkins was the major donor for an orphanage and he gave one of his properties as a school for the blind. He and his brother James were founding members of Massachusetts General Hospital. Although Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.'s reference to the Brahmin caste of New England did not appear in print until the early 1860s, an elite influential class, whose wealth derived from mercantile enterprise was well established by the 1840s, and it mirrored that of the Indian Seths, the upper class businessmen in Bombay, particularly the Parsis. So while the Boston Brahmins enjoyed the luxury commodities of the East India trade, one of the most popular American commodities that was transported across the oceans towards the East Indies may come as a bit of a surprise to some of you. Robert Bennett Forbes refers to seeing the ship Paul Jones leaving New York in December of 1843, carrying the first American ice to China and some to Singapore. In fact, the ice trade to that part of the world had begun 10 years earlier, when the first cargo of American ice had been shipped out of Boston to Calcutta by Frederick Tudor, whose bust Peter found and put in the little display case on his ship, the Tuscany. Thereafter, ice became a very useful ballast, which could also be sold at profit on arrival, provided it had been properly packed in the hold. By the time of Forbes' comment in 1843, Tudor's Ice Company had a well-established market in Calcutta, Madras, ice houses in Calcutta, Madras, that's modern Chennai, and Bombay. The latter city was the last to construct a place to store ice near to the docks, and that was one of Tudor's requirements before he would commit to transport ice on a regular basis. There had to be a means of storing the ice very close to the docks, and they were often allowed to unload the ice at night to minimize the wastage. It was interesting to me to note that Thomas Wren Ward, who by the 1830s had become the American agent for the British firm of Barings, he had been initially very reluctant to insure Tudor in his ice trade business. 2 decades later, when Thoreau wrote his famous passage, which is also in the exhibition outside, about the pure water of Walden Pond mingling with the sacred waters of the Ganges, ice from the frozen lakes of New England had become one of the most lucrative US exports to India. And this is the first ice house in Bombay here. It's between the Scottish church and what was then a judicial building. And it was built by subscription in the early 1840s, with many Parsis, including members of the Wadia family, participating in the enterprise from the outset. The Calvin W. Smith papers in the MHS collection provide insights into the process of storing and selling the ice in Bombay in the 1860s, as well as continued contact with the Wadia family. Smith was a former Union soldier who had fought in the Civil War and had been injured in early 1864. He came to the city in March of 1865 to take up his post as bookkeeper for the Tudor Ice Company. Soon after his arrival, Smith writes home. This bit here, I don't know whether you can see it. I have now been here about 20 days. What I've seen of the place, I think I can manage to live. But if anyone comes out here for amusement, they would be badly disappointed. Last Sunday, I went out to Parel, a place about 2 miles out of town. Of course, it's not right in the middle of Bombay. Visited a Parsi by name Dosaboy Mowanji, and from his place to the governor's house and grounds. They're very handsome, and I enjoyed the drive through his grounds very much. Dosaboy Mowanji Wadia was the great nephew of Nusawanji Monekji, our Parsi in the portrait. As ice from Walden Pond was being unloaded at the Bombay docks back in Massachusetts, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau were becoming increasingly interested in the teachings of Indian religions as containing truths that were relevant to all humans in all ages. Emerson's essays, his early lectures, and his selections of ethnical scriptures for the transcendentalist journal The Dial of 1843 present the Hindu enlightened everyman, Manu, and the Persian teacher, Zoroaster, as exemplars of universal, timeless wisdom. Meanwhile, back in Bombay, Dosaboy Mohanji Wadia's firm was acting as agent brokers for several New England shipping merchants, including the Bacon brothers, or Bacon's Company of Boston. The financial records of this company detail invoices of shipments to and from India on several ships, and this included many items that were provided by or shipped on behalf of Dosaboy Mohanji. His company supplied different types of wool, rags, and I'm assuming that's for making paper, cowhides from Aden, presumably for making shoes and belts. There's a great leather industry around here. Linseed, which would have been used for printer's ink and varnish and paint, and also blackwood furniture. These were all among the goods that were shipped to New England directly from India, but also the hides from Aden, Yemen. Elaborately carved blackwood furniture was made from Indian rosewood, and it had become very popular along the east coast of the United States. In this antebellum period, of course, it's not just commodities that are arriving from India, but Parsis themselves began to venture from Bombay to England and then on to New York and Massachusetts and beyond. One such visitor was a Dosaboy Mohanji Wadia's nephew, whose name was Rustamji Hirjiboy. He had been studying in England and then came to New York. He was hosted for part of his visit in 1860 to 61 by the Bacons. And it must have been one of the Bacons, I think, or another client who sponsored, he was setting up, he was setting himself up as an agent for a sewing machine company and various other New England companies. So it would have been the Bacons or one of these clients who sponsored Rustamji in his initiation as a Freemason to Montauk Lodge 286 in Brooklyn, New York in February of 1861. And I haven't yet been able to access those records to see who sponsored him. Such involvement with Freemasonry by the Parsi elite would have been understood to cement their status not only within the social, cultural, and commercial milieu of British-run Bombay, but also within an increasingly global business network. Another Parsi on a tour with a co-religionist through northeastern America in the following year, 1862. So we're in the Civil War now. Rustamji manages to get out just in time, but there were others who were arriving in this part of the world once the Civil War had started. So this Parsi, he heard Abraham Lincoln speak in person in Washington. And he subsequently wrote a letter to the New York Evening Post with his impressions of America. So this is one of the few instances that we have from this period of Parsis or Zoroastrians writing about what they know of America and Americans. He says, I was struck with the institutions and the general aspect of the country. I was amazed at the energy, the accomplishments, and the civilization of the people. Everything around me inspired me with lofty and exalted thoughts. At around the same time as this Parsi plaudit of the United States, Calvin Smith, our icehouse accountant, reports that in Bombay, cholera was rampant and that he had been much occupied in selling the 326 barrels of New England apples that had recently been unloaded along with a cargo of ice. And the ice was much in demand as it was the hot season. He writes home, "I've been very busy the last 8 days selling the apples that we brought out. I never saw such a mob as we had here. I armed myself with a club, and it was all I could do to keep them from breaking down the counter and helping themselves. I made many sore heads those 8 days." So he took his job very seriously. By this period, Americans had established quite a community of merchants, mariners, and missionaries in Bombay. Smith remarks that the ice house is the headquarters for all the American skippers and many English that come to this port. So you can imagine what kind of society we have here. On the ship Tennyson out of Boston, Smith enjoyed a regular Yankee dinner of codfish in every style, salmon and clam. I wound up with a dish of baked beans and brown bread. Those are articles we don't get out here except on the ships. By April the 25th, 1865, Smith had received news from home concerning the success of the Civil War. That, he said, rejoices the heart of every American in this place, but which had brought long faces to the English and the Parsis. He wrote, "Our success at home is their ruination. Such wild speculation as has been going on here for the last 4 years never was heard of before. Cotton companies here whose shares were at a premium of $50,000 when I came out here, and now at $2,500. Let that war end, and the Lord can only tell where they will go to." So where did they go? Although several British and American and Parsi firms did crash, some of the family businesses were able to rally their collective resources, enabling them to survive and to reinvent themselves as global companies, which are still trading today. This is the case for the Wadia Group, which traces its origins to Nusawanji Manekji's grandfather, the shipbuilder for the British, Lauji Nusawanji. And it's Lauji Nusawanji's immediate descendants who had been so integral to the development of cultural and commercial relations between the US and India. Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, please raise their hand.
Obviously, I said it.
You had mentioned, I think, some of the ships going to China for the opium trade. Once at the Peabody Essex Museum, curator had said that on the Dutch East India Company, much of their trade was actually not directly, let's say, between Holland and the Orient, but they would make a lot of stops along the way. Did these ships between Boston and India make intermittent stops for trading, as well as obviously provisioning and things like that?
Yes, and there are lots of different trade venues. They begin by trading through the Isle of France, Mauritius. So that's a kind of staging area. Elias Haskett Derby Sr. made most of his money through pepper, which came from the further into the area called the East Indies. So they're going to Indonesia as well. Bombay initially seems to have been a bit of an afterthought. His son Haskett comes back with too much cotton. So they have to then take the cotton and sell it, some of it in England. So there becomes a kind of triangulation of trade. There's also trade through Zanzibar. So the Waters family, that John Rogers, I think, is working with Richard P. Waters, and they're trading through Zanzibar to Bombay. But by the time Augustine Hurd has developed his company, he has branches in Hong Kong and Shanghai and Canton. So they're moving lots of different goods between lots of different ports on lots of different ships, and often sometimes trading off on the ships. Can I tell you an interesting story? So I have lots of interesting, but the perhaps one of the most fascinating ones. So in 1848, Dosaboy Mwanji's brother, Kursetji Mwanji Wadia, takes Edward Horatio Faucon, who's the captain of an opium clipper named the Frolic, on an inland tour from Bombay to Pune and back. And he writes an account of it. This is a log that's held in the Phillips Library. So it's really fascinating. So Faucon continues to, Faucon's the captain who brought the Pilgrim back from California to Bombay, if you know of Richard Henry Dana's accounts of 2 years before the Mast. So 1835 this is. So by 1848, he's an opium clipper captain doing this run between Bombay and China and then back. In not long after that, he's bringing the Frolic back to California along the west coast, loaded with China, but that blue and white Chinese porcelain. And the Frolic runs aground and is wrecked. The Faucon survives. But when there was an archaeologist who was doing work with the Pomo Native Americans, he finds pieces of blue and white pottery in their encampment, which was the result of the Frolic running ashore, and this has been rescued from the wreckage of the Frolic. So it is a completely global movement of goods and people. Yes.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. I was actually born in Bombay, in Parel, in a hospital that actually was founded by the Wadia family called the Wadia Hospital. And now Boston is my adopted home. So thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I guess my question is, why the Parsis? The caste system would have been just as strong in India back at that time as it is today. And we know that there were a lot of Gujaratis, Marwadis that were also traders and brokers. So why the Parsis? And why do they seem to play such a dominant role? Or is that not?
Yeah, it's really interesting. My sense is that the Parsis probably perhaps did not have the caste prohibitions on mixing with others. They wouldn't eat with them. I mean, we have some wonderful accounts of Yankee and New York visitors hanging out with Dosaboy Mwanji at his house and sitting in the garden drinking cups of tea, but they don't eat together with the Parsis, but they are engaged in direct business transactions with them, going to the warehouse and looking through the shawls and whatever, and acting as interpreters. And they also have a whole network of providers who would find houses for these American sea captains. When Rogers arrives, his one of his fellow Salem captains already has a house there that is being run by a Parsi Dubash, and the chef is a Parsi. And so it seems that they, I don't think there was this kind of, obviously the women were not part of this transaction. There's an account when John Johnston goes to the Dosaboy's home and he accidentally goes into the wrong room and all the women scurry out of the door. And you're right, there of course there are many Hindu, Jain, Muslim traders who are written about and are part of this process, but the Parsis do seem to take a kind of prominent position, partly perhaps because they were skilled shipbuilders and carpenters, and so they're brought to and weavers too. They're producing cotton in Gujarat, and then so they're controlling the whole process of producing the cotton, weaving the cotton, selling the cotton, and this particularly the very, very fine muslin that the European ladies love to wear. That very like fairy stuff. One of the British authors describes it as. And I would guess that once they're established in that situation, that their situation just builds from there. They also have, from the beginning, they have this reputation as being honest. And that, yes, that was something that they, of course, they promote themselves.
To follow up on that, could you tell the story about the ship Minerva, the ship built in Bombay where the
HMS Minden.
Minden, yes.
Yes. So the Wadias continue to be the master ship. I mean, this is another reason they were the master shipbuilders for the East India Company. So they, you know, they have a lot of, they're building ships for the British to participate in the Napoleonic Wars. So they're really quite important. Although there's a story about Jamshedji Bomanji Wadia, who's the one who builds the Minden. 1810, he's commissioned to build the first man of war that's constructed in India, and it launches and doesn't actually take part in the Napoleonic. Well, it does. It takes a part in a few melees, and then in about 1814, it ends up on the east coast of the States, where the Anglo-American wars are taking place, and it's, we think, a flag of truce ship during the Battle of Fort McHenry in September of 1814. And who's on board the flag of truce ship but Francis Scott Key, who is watching. He's come to parley for a prisoner exchange, and he's, where is he? Is he on the deck? Is he below the deck? Somehow he sees the rocket's red glare over Fort McHenry and pens a poem that then becomes really important. What happens to the ship eventually is that it's deconstructed in Hong Kong, and it's William in the 1860s, and William Noyce, who has a middle initial that I can't remember, fashions a walking stick out of one of the timbers that he's rescued from this decommissioned, deconstructed HMS Minden, that he then presents to Abraham Lincoln. So the story is that somewhere under, I can't remember which bit of the boat it is, but Jamsetji Bomanji writes, you know, this ship was commissioned by a white man and executed by a black man. So he has his, you know, this, there is a tension. Generally, there is an affability and an acceptance and a welcoming, but that little story tells us that, you know, there is a tension.
I just had a follow-up question. Are there examples or evidence where Yankees might have liked it so much that are there individuals that actually decided to settle in Bombay? Any of the trading, like Ochterlony, Bostonian liked Delhi so much he he lived there,
Yes.
died there.
Sorry, I'm trying to think. There's a book about American nabobs. I mean, there were many merchants who went out there for many years. One of the agents for Bacon's was John Anderson, and he went out. He was from Massachusetts, and he went out with his wife to Bombay, and then they lived in Singapore for a long time. And he ordered one of the account books of Bacon's shows the Blackwood furniture that he ordered for both his house in Singapore and his house in Haverhill, I think it is, in Massachusetts. And he's working with Dosaboy Mwangi. But that's in Singapore. But I think when they start building steam engines, there's a whole steam engine office related to the steamships in Bombay. And Smith is out there. He's out in Bombay and then Calcutta for 4 years at least. So they're there for kind of lengths, quite long periods of time. And there must have been intermarriages and liaisons.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Jenny Rose for a wonderful presentation, and we have books for sale right outside the door. There's also the display right on the other side of that wall. And for people joining us online, I hope that they will consider buying it from their favorite online retailer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.